So in general, let's just do a quick review for blood spatter and pattern analysis. Because this is what you're going to be doing in the lab next week, where we will have a spatter pattern out there, and you will be expected to find the area of convergence and the area of origin. So remember, the area of convergence, well, first off, even before we get to there, let's say that we have, this was our blood droplet. Of course, this would be filled in. I would expect you to know the directionality. So what direction was this traveling? Was it traveling either from the lower left-hand corner to the upper right-hand corner, or was it going from the right to the left? Left. It's left to right. And the reason being, let me see, I think it's an arrow. Is remember, it's always the tail. Let me just move that out of the way. The tail gives it away. Okay. Likewise, we can now also tell we have the direction that's flowing, but we can also determine the angle that it came from when it hit. Okay, and so to do that, remember you have to measure the length and the width. So the width at the widest part. So that's the width, and the length of the ellipses. Now some of these have really long tails where it's just kind of little drops afterwards. You just want the relative length of the ellipsis here. And so let me do this different color. So in that color, that's the length. And so to get that angle, we have to do width divided by length is equal to sine theta. And that theta is the angle that it hit. And so if you have a scientific calculator, you should have a function that looks like this. Sine to the -1 power. That's inverse sine in the sense that what it does is you would enter in, width divided by length. It's always going to be the number 1 or less. It cannot be greater than 1. And so let's say that your number came out to 0.3. Then you take 0.3 and most scientific calculators, you just hit this symbol and it will find the angle for you. Okay, so that's inverse sine. So like that addition and subtraction are inverse functions, or multiplication and division. Well, sine and inverse sine are inverse functions. And so this is when you know this number and you're trying to find the angle. Use that inverse sine on your button on your calculator. Okay. And so we're going to do that in lab this next week. We also, let me show. There we go. And so remember what happens is you want to do as many blood droplets as possible. You find out what direction they came from, not what direction that they're heading towards. You just stretch a line, which we use yarn. You stretch that out, and the area where they all hit in 2 dimensions is called the area of convergence. Okay, so that's the area of convergence. Then the way to find the area of origin is you literally will take a pole, and you will stand a pole up directly here on the area of convergence. So if this is on the floor, which ours will be on the floor, you'll just put the pole there on top of it. Then you figure out the angle that each of these was traveling, and you stretch another piece of yarn from that blood to wherever it hits the pole at that angle. And so that's why it definitely takes at least 2 people, if not 3, to do this. What you'll find out is that they all will converge within a general area for the most part on that pole, and that tells you how high up off the ground the victim was standing when he or she was hit by the object that caused the blood to spatter like that. So this is what they're trying to depict here, where this, I can't tell the colors, but where this color of yarn indicates the area of convergence, so they put their pole there, then they raised their pole and they started to figure out what angle each of those were hitting at. Now they only did like 3 3 or 4 points. So the more points you do, the better typically. You can also sometimes get an idea if there was more than one blow, because if you have more than one area of origin, then that would be indication that there could possibly be more than one blow, or the victim was falling or moving whenever he or she was being hit. Okay. Then we ended the class by going over high, medium, and low velocity spatter. And so, just remember, I expected you to know the diameter and the speed, approximately with which each of these were come off at, and also to give an example. So what's the example for high velocity spatter? Gunshot wound, and then there's another one that's a possibility. Like an explosion, something. I mean, it has to be going more than 100 feet per second. And remember, its diameter is less than or equal to, less than 1 millimeter in diameter. So they're just really tiny. Whereas low velocity spatter, its diameter typically is greater than 3 millimeters, and it has to be traveling less than 5 feet per second. So what were some examples of low velocity spatter? A paper cut, blood dripping on top of blood. Okay. Sometimes you can even just sling blood off of something, and if it hits the wall of the ground, then that could be low impact, so it's only going 5 feet per second or less. And of course, medium's in between that. Typically 5 to 25. Sometimes they may say like 5 to 75 feet per second. Its diameter will be 1 to 3 millimeters. And what was an example? What's the textbook example of medium velocity impact spatter? Blunt force trauma, usually like someone being beaten with a bat or a club or something like that. Okay, it tends to be medium velocity impact spatter. And we also talked about forward versus backward spatter. And that's especially true for cast off. So you can tell the directionality. It may look like it's going both directions because you have someone that's taking a bloody weapon and smacking it going frontwards and backwards, and so you've got them going both directions. Okay. That there are 12 different spatter patterns that I do expect you to know, and I'm really looking for the logic behind these, because sometimes you really can't tell. So you would have to say, assuming, such and such, it would be this. Let me find my notes. So that way I don't skip over anything. Physical evidence. But the first one we talked about was satellite spatter. And what was the satellite spatter? Correct. That's where sometimes you get the little tiny droplets around the larger area of blood. And so, similar way that the satellites circle the Earth. Well, that's part of it. There we go. But not the part that I was waiting. And so, here it is. Those are considered satellite spatters. And so there's really, really tiny spots of blood that hit from where the original blood, so maybe blood dripping in blood and splashing, or even just blood splashing in general. There it is. Okay. And then we also talked about gunshot spatter, which I was unable to get hopefully that still works, because it won't let me click on it in this app. But they won't let us use it for copyright reasons, even for educational purposes. Most websites will let you use their pictures for educational purposes, but not this one. But gunshot spatter was going to be massive damage. And so it's going to be high velocity. There could be also brain matter, depending upon what part, or body tissue that would be involved in the spatter as well. So those were the first two, and I think that's where we left off. So the third is cast off. Okay? What do you suppose cast off spatter is?
Like
Right. I've actually already mentioned this because it's what's being flung off of a weapon, or you could even have it flung off of a hand or something like that. It can even be flung off of a knife, a bat, a club, any type of object like that. What's some of the information that you can get from cast-off spatter?
Where the weapon is.
Pardon?
Maybe where the weapon was.
Sometimes you can get an idea if it's got the characteristic tails.
The amount of blood.
You can get an idea of the amount of blood. What else can we get?
The direction is weapon is like swinging, I guess.
Right. So you're going to get both backwards and forward.
Can you tell the right or left?
I don't know so much about right or left-handed, but you're close in the sense that sometimes you can also get an idea of the thickness, the diameter of the weapon. Because if you think about it, if it's a knife, the trail, the cast-off is going to be really tiny and skinny in line. Whereas if it's a big blunt object like a bat, you can imagine that blood being flung off will be wider, the trail. But even more importantly is sometimes you can get a minimum number of blows. Because if you think about it, the very first blow coming down won't have any blood on it. When he or she raises their arm up, the blood can get flung off, goes down the second time, that time they can have blood going forward, blood going back, forward, back. And so you can just count the number of forwards and backs. And just remember that the very first one, there was no blood on the weapon to begin with. And so that's why I say it's a minimum number, because if they overlap, then you may not be able to differentiate one from the other, but you can kind of get an idea of the minimum number of blows, even without looking at the body. This is the arterial spray. So first of all, what do we mean by arterial spray? An artery. So we have two types of blood vessels. We'll actually talk a little bit more about the blood vessels. Two main types of blood vessels, I should say. We'll talk a little bit more about those whenever we do toxicology and drugs and alcohol metabolism. But because we have it's called a closed circulatory system, which means our blood in our circulatory system isn't exposed to the air. It's a closed system. So we have veins and we have arteries. Arteries is where the blood's being pushed away from the heart. Veins means the blood's coming towards the heart. Then we have capillaries, which are the other types, which are really like the little branches, the little tiny ones. Some of them are so small that only a single blood cell can get through at a time. So if you cut a capillary, that's like the paper cut, you just barely bleed. You cut a vein, you can bleed quite a bit, but with only one exception. It's not going to be oxygenated, and secondly, it's not going to be as highly powerful because the fact is it's it's going back towards the heart, so it's not as powerful. Whereas if you cut an artery, that's where it's coming from the heart, and so it tends to be more spurty, like the kind in the campy horror movies where it goes, yeah, that happens. Okay, so it does spurt like that. So typically, is there going to be a lot of blood or not much blood in arterial spray? Typically a lot, okay? And it sometimes can even border on the high velocity, depending upon what artery it is. And I have to be careful here because what happens, like if you've seen those hokey horror movies, what happens when, say, someone cuts an artery at first? Like you get a spray, okay, but then what happens?
Keep spraying beating the heart.
With every beat. And so it'll squirt and then not, squirt and then not, right? And then eventually the person will die. And so with each successive heartbeat, it gets less and less in diameter, less and less force. And so that's why it may start off really high velocity, but then it's going to get weaker and weaker. And so you can get an idea even of if the person is moving. And I know it's really sad, but you can see here's the first heartbeat, the second, the third, and of course then you're going to start to flatline. Okay, so But yeah, with each heartbeat, you can see in arterials, it's like a radial spike because it spikes out so the blood. So that's characteristic of arterial spray. And of course, like I said, eventually the blood pressure will be so little that he or she would bleed out. Does anyone have any questions? If you do, just holler. Expirated blood, not expired. Okay, not as in like an expiration date. It's kind of hard to see on this one. But what does it mean if it's expirated blood?
Well, when, like, it comes out of something that bears blood, is there any other thing?
That's what?
Sorry, that was confusing. Where, like, is that where, like, if someone, like, sneezes blood or, like, stuff like that?
It could be sneezed. What else can be expired? Like a cough, spit, saliva. It's coming from the respiratory system. Okay? And so we can't hardly see it on here. You can kind of make it out. It's easier to see. Well, that and my pointer, I think, is also the same color as the blood. So I can't tell when I'm pointing. So I'm going to have to point it. So you can kind of make part of it out here and there. But if you think about it, what else could be inside? I'm trying to point it out, but what else could be inside the expirated blood?
Spit.
Well, there could be spit or saliva or mucus, snot. Well, there could be, yes, there could be carbon dioxide, and that's going to come looking like what whenever it comes out? Little bubbles, right? So, because there could be bubbles, and there are actually some tiny bubbles in expirated blood in this picture. It's kind of hard to see. And so, because it's coming out of parts of your body that you're breathing, and so there will be air bubbles, or can be air bubbles in it. What about the color, especially if it's from your mouth? Like the color of that blood versus, say, the arterial spray that we just saw. It's usually lighter. For a couple of reasons. One is it could be more dilute. You got spit or mucus or something wrong with it. Okay. Yeah, expirated just means it came out. Usually we're talking about it through the mouth, but it could also be from your nose, respiratory system in your nose. This is called a void pattern, and it's unique in the sense that a void pattern is the absence of blood. And so it's kind of difficult to tell here, but they've had, they've got, we have this blood, and then this was a piece of tape or something that was laying down when the blood was, sprayed over the area. And so whenever it's moved, it leaves a void. Okay, and so this can sometimes, what can a void tell you?
That there was an object there.
That there was an object there. So, for example, what if you see like an object, like a shape, it's almost like in cartoons, like when someone like runs through the wall and leaves that little person shape? Well, you can imagine that if there's all this blood and then there's a big void there, that could give an idea that there's someone that was standing there whenever the blood was sprayed. Or your book has a picture of where you could tell if the door was open or closed, because the door was open whenever it was sprayed, even if someone had tried to clean it or whatever, if it's a fine mist. But what happens if they close the door, then you can see the void where the door was. Things like that. You can tell if objects have been moved because they leave behind the lack of blood, leaves a void pattern. This is easy, contact or transfer. Sometimes it's called contact, sometimes it's called transfer patterns. But how would you describe this one? What does it mean if it's been a contact or a transfer pattern? It's not, it's where a bloody object has left behind an imprint. And so this is a footprint, obviously. So you step in blood, you transfer it elsewhere, you get blood on your hands, and you go and touch something, so like a bloody fingerprint, technically would be a contact or a transfer pattern. Bloody knife that you lay down and pick up, anything like that. You're just transferring it from one location to another location. And so, it can give you lots of information depending upon what what was doing the contact. So this would give you an idea of the type of shoe, the size of the shoe, things like that. This is called a swipe pattern. So what do you suppose a swipe is? Some of these are hopefully self-explanatory. So give an example of a swipe.
The body's being dragged.
Right. That, or even with your hand, if you've seen scenes from movies or whatever when like the dying person's like reaching and grabbing and like there's blood's like getting smeared. So it's a smear. What can you judge from this one in particular? What's one piece of information that we can get from here? What about the directionality? Can we say anything about the direction it was going? Right, it's going this direction because of the fact that there's more blood here and it gets thinner. And so whatever is being swiped up towards the upper left-hand side. This is the flow. It's called a flow pattern. And there are two types. Okay? One's called active and one's called passive. But first off, let me see if I can move this out of the way so I can. And so, what is it, when I say flow pattern, what does it do to? And what's it's a very basic, general, fundamental part of nature. Gravity. This is just where gravity is acting on blood, causing the blood to flow. It's a movement of blood due to gravity. Okay, I'm trying to not say it without using the word flow. So it's the movement of blood due to gravity. Of blood due to gravity. Okay, and there are two types. There's active and passive. Okay. So there's active. And what do you suppose it means if it's an active blood flow?
Still flowing?
It's still what?
Flowing?
Okay, it's coming from an actively bleeding wound. Remember, once a person is dead, their heart is no longer beating, and so the blood no longer is being pumped. It's going to just be due to flow from an actively bleeding wound, or location, I guess, in that sense. And then we have passive. So if that was active, what do you suppose passive is going to be? So if you cut yourself and you just lay there and you let the blood flow from your body and gravity take its effect, that's going to be active. So then what would passive blood be? Like, we can't really tell if this one's active or passive because you don't see what's on the other side of the door. Pardon? So it could be coming from the dead person in that sense. Or it just means that it's originating from blood that's deposited on a surface. So if you just had like a pool of blood and you on a plate or whatever, and you turned it over, then it's just going to start to, if it hasn't already, solidified or dried, it's going to start to flow. That would be passive. So it originates. How did I word it better? From blood deposited on a surface. Or another, actually a really good example of that would be, let's say, like that arterial spray that we saw before. it sprayed, got on the wall, and then due to gravity, it starts to go down that wall. That would be that's a type of passive flow. Like, okay, this is really hard to tell, but this is a pool of blood. That looks like it's like a curb or a sidewalk. So you could even say that this was passive flow here, but a pool is similar to flow, but it's on a level surface, so it's not really going to be going downhill, so to speak. It's just going to be collecting in a pool. So they call it blood pooling. And so that's why when I ask this on the exam and I give you like bloody pictures, that I'm going to ask you to explain your logic. Because you could say one person would be right, say, oh, there's passive flow here because we have gravity forcing it down off the curb. Another person could say, oh, it's due to blood pooling because it's on the level street. So I'm just looking for the logic there. This is a cool one. It's called Skeletonization. We only have two. We have this one more. So give everybody a moment to get caught up. So I got to take me a swig of my coffee. Definitely multiple cups of coffee morning. Okay. So what do you suppose skeletonization means?
It forms your own body.
Dried out blood.
It's dried, but in particular, it's kind of hard to see in the color here, but if you look at the PowerPoints or look at it on the computer, it's a little bit more obvious. Coffee actually does this really well. So if you imagine well, I'm not going to spill my coffee deliberately, but I don't know about you, if your mom or your grandma or even your father or grandpa or whatever, and they would set their coffee down, or they'd get aggravated when people set their drink or their coffee down, because what could possibly happen? It leaves a ring, and then if you just use your hand and try to wipe it, and it had started to dry, but it wasn't fully dried yet, what happens? It smears, but you still see that little crusty part of the ring that's left. That's skeletonization. So this is where there was a big blood droplet here. The edges had started to solidify, to get crusty, and someone's trying to clean it up or move it. And so it leaves the skeletonization, the skeleton behind. Okay? So that's where the edges of this stain has started to dry. And so this will indicate that it's been disturbed, obviously. And sometimes it's going to be more difficult to clean than if the blood was still wet, of course. So you can talk about skeletonization. You can kind of see if someone's trying to clean something up or if an object has been moved, what it originally looked like. And last but not least, we have a trail pattern. And I pulled this off of a crime scene, like a highway patrol, like a police officers type of website. So I don't know if that really is a person or if that was just for training. Let's hope that it was just for training purposes and it isn't someone who's really being there. Okay, so what do you suppose a trail pattern is? It leaves a trail. It's blood dropping off of something, an object that is moving. Okay, and so what kinds of information can you get from this?
The direction.
You can get the direction, especially if it leaves, because it's going to leave, if it's not perfectly round. If it was a perfectly round drop, what does it tell you about how quickly that it was moving? Really slowly, because otherwise it's going to be, smeared out. And so, because remember, 90 degrees makes it almost perfectly round.
Maybe how big the wound.
At least how big the weapon or whatever it was, possibly. Because if you have something that's got a really fine tip on it, it's going to leave a little drop versus something really big. But it definitely gives you an idea of the directionality. And sometimes, whether or not the person was running or walking. Obviously they're not running here because the drops are close together. Okay. So are there any questions over any of this? So the 12 patterns? Once again, I'm be looking for things like directionality, anything special. Some of them, like the Expirated is special because it usually is a different color. It can have air bubbles. Things like that. Because on Friday. Yeah, Friday. That's right, today is Wednesday. I'm ready for Friday already. So on Friday, what we're going to do is we're going to have an in-class assignment. But what it is where you have to make sure you bring a sheet of paper. I'm going to put up a scene, like a crime scene or a blood scene, and I'll give you a little bit of time, and I just want you to write down what you can about it, like what kind of pattern you think it is, anything special about it, that kind of stuff, and then we discuss it.
And that's Friday.
Yeah, it's going to be Friday in class, because I have several pictures, and that way you can kind of get an idea, because that kind of stuff will definitely be on the exam, where you see a scene, and you have to try to start to describe what the blood is telling you. So you guys can all be your own little Dexters. And so, okay, are there any questions over any of this? Because if not, I'm going to go at one thing is, if at all possible, since there's no one new, on Monday we have 2 people that are in lab that aren't in lecture. But since everybody that's in the Wednesday section of lab is also in lecture, if we get everybody there earlier, we can get started earlier and end earlier. So I'll go ahead and end class with prayer. So Heavenly Father, I want to praise you and thank you for this wonderful day. And I ask that you reach down and take, guide us and direct us, keep your hand over us, and help us learn to manage our time wisely. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. No, what's wanting to turn off. There we go.
Is it okay if I sign this? I know I showed up late. I had to go run and get my shoes because I remember for the lab we were
I
having
can
to put
sign
on.
it.
Sorry about that.
It's okay.
Because I was like walking right into class and then I was like, oh crap, I don't have the right shoes on because we're doing that today. So I had to run and get new shoes.
Okay.
Sorry.